Is this PowerPoint available to them later? It's fine. Let me see.
Hey, good morning. I just want to check and make sure that everyone can hear me. All right, good. We'll go ahead and get started. First off, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this morning on this Alicomp OSAA webinar series. Today's topic is going to be new hire safety orientations, new employee safety. One of the reasons that we're targeting that is when we look through the demographic data related to our claims, we find a large bulk of the claims and the dollars spent you can attribute to employees who are at a tenure level of 1 year or less. And our statistics show that if we can get employees beyond that first year of employment, their propensity to have a claim drops pretty significantly. So the purpose of this particular webinar is to walk through some areas to hopefully we can put plans in place, training measures in place to get those employees beyond the first year of employment and hopefully get them past that point to where they're going to be less likely to have an injury. Presenting our webinar this morning, we're going to have Rick Hunter with Alabama Risk Management. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Rick.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Scott. Yeah, it is important that each time we bring on new employees or we're onboarding is that we cover the information, especially the unique hazards of the facility. And I know with today's environment, a lot of people are hiring direct or they're using a temp service, but making sure that the employees understand the safety and health responsibilities and all the things that they need to do is critically important in today's environment. So I thought today a couple of the objectives. Obviously, we're going to talk about new employee orientation, new employee safety training. Above all things, preventing accidents and injuries is the #1 focus. We always want to prevent accidents and injuries. We want to raise the safety awareness level in our facilities. Obviously, we have to comply with federal regulations and make sure that we explain the unique hazards of the facility because employees come from maybe one company over to another company and those hazards change. So making sure that they understand the hazards of the facility that they're currently working at when you're onboarding someone. Some of the topics we'll talk about is emergency response. We'll talk about fire extinguishers, lifting and moving, the slip, trip, fall, sprain, strain type injuries that we see so much of. We'll touch on ergonomics just for a moment, but one of the things I really want to focus on is parking lot safety. Sometimes that's an area that we kind of skip over a little bit and then we end up with an issue in a parking lot. So I want to talk about that for a moment. Hazards in the facilities. We'll talk about personal protective equipment, the PPE, crane awareness, lift truck awareness, HAZCOM, safety data sheets, SDSs, and we'll also talk about lockout, tagout, which is a huge subject in today's environment. You can typically count on, if you get an OSHA visit and they come in on a programmed inspection, 3 things that you're going to have to, or really 4 things you're going to have to provide to them if you have these in your facility. #1, obviously the past 3 years of your OSHA 300 log, so make sure you keep up with that, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But also any machine guarding, any lift truck, any lockout, tagout, your forklift programs. Those are the things that they're definitely going to focus on if they see the need in that facility. Like if during the walkthrough they see forklifts, then obviously they're going to want to look at your program to make sure you're doing the things that you need to do. So we'll start out this morning talking about emergency response, and we're talking about medical emergencies. Obviously, we need to call 911, but I tell people all the time that when you have a new employee coming on board, make sure that they know who the designated responder is. Make sure you introduce them to that person. It might be a nurse, it might be someone in your facility that has gone through the first aid CPR courses, and so make sure they know who that is. And if you happen to have an emergency in your facility, And you have to call 911 as the emergency responders arrive. Make sure someone's there to flag them down. So many times today, we have to be carted in and outdoors. Make sure they're not hung up at a door trying to find somebody to let them in. So make sure that when you're talking to new employees that they understand that these are the procedures and we want to make this make it as smooth as possible. Also know where your first aid kits are located. If they're in the office, if they're on the floor, if they're in the shop or the break area, make sure they understand all those things and they don't touch anything that's contaminated with blood, some kind of body fluid that has blood on in it. It could be a bloodborne pathogen, and make sure that we do that type training as well. Again, to protect the new employee and make sure they understand the company responsibilities. So we've gone through the medical. If we go into the fire emergencies, you know, large fires, larger than a wastebasket, a large amount of smoke and alarm, make sure they know the nearest exit. Make sure they understand the emergency action plan. Obviously, those designated exits are typically posted on the wall somewhere where you've divided up, and you can teach the employee that if this happens and you're in this location of the plant, be sure you understand you go through this exit, and that you assemble somewhere, whether it's the water tower or maybe it's the parking lot near the flagpole. There's a lot of different areas, but just to make sure that they understand all those things, and that, you know, once you evacuate, obviously 911 calls, the fire department arrives. Now, keep in mind, when the fire department arrives at your facility, two things are going to take place. Number one, if everyone is accounted for, if you've done your head count and all employees are accounted for, they're going to focus on fighting the fire. But if someone's not accounted for, or maybe a few people are not accounted for, then they're going to go into search and rescue. And there's nothing frustrates the fire department any worse than go into search and rescue and come back and say, oh, we forgot. Scott's on vacation today, and that's really frustrating to them. So make sure your employees know that when they hear the fire alarm go off in the plant. Now, we do these test sessions every so often, and I was in a facility not long ago when it was a planned fire alarm test. We were going to time the employees, see if they could leave the facility and assemble at their assembly area, which was in the front parking lot, and we were trying to get that under that 2-minute range. And I was amazed when the fire alarm went off. I saw people standing there looking at each other saying, well, what's going on? Teach your employees when they hear that means immediate action. Finally, someone said, well, that's the fire alarm. So they began to evacuate. So talk to them, make sure they understand these things, and not to go when they leave the facility. Don't go sit in your car. You got to go to a place where you're in the head count and that you are accounted for, those type things. So that's important. And sometimes new employees don't understand that, and they may be the ones standing out there going, well, what is that? Where's everybody going? Simply because they don't understand. And I think we can do a better job at doing those type things. Now, also, if we have that fire, and you know, if you look in 29 CFR 1910-157, which is for portable fire extinguishers, you'll see in the training session of that particular standard that it says that training is required upon initial employment and annually thereafter, is what the standard says. And you got to remember that if you have fire extinguishers in place and they are available or they are accessible for employees to either protect themselves or protect property, then that training is required. Everyone's not required to use a fire extinguisher. Your company may have that policy in place, but if they do, they need to know a little bit about what they're doing. So when we talk about fire extinguishers, there are 4 classes of fires we basically deal with. You know, class A, B, C, and D is how they classify fires. Class A would be wood, paper, plastic. Class B would be fuel, oil, grease. Class C is electrical. And Class D is something we rarely ever deal with today, maybe occasionally. But Class D is your metal fires, your potassium, sodium, magnesiums, aluminums, things of that nature. So being prepared for that. But if you look on the side of your fire extinguisher located in your facility, and be sure to point this out because this is important information to that new person who may not know these things. But if you look down the side of it, you'll see A, B, C, because it is designed to extinguish those 3 classes of fires. Again, wood, paper, plastic, fuel, oil, grease, and then electrical fires being the C-class fires. So understand that when they take that fire extinguisher down, that they understand how to use the fire extinguisher and to protect themselves. Because remember that fire extinguisher is a piece of equipment. They do leak down. Sometimes they don't operate properly. It is rare. I'll be the first one to admit it's rare that happens, but it does. So as we prepare to teach fire extinguisher training, we teach the PASS system. We also tell the employees that fire extinguishers are for inception stage fires only. If that fire begins to spread and build, then obviously it's time to evacuate the building, then call 911 and let the fire department come do their job. And also keep in mind the fire extinguisher has about 30 seconds to a minute or a couple of minutes, depending on whether it's a 2-pound, 5-pound, 10-pound, whatever size fire extinguisher that may. But we teach the PASS system. Just remember PASS, P-A-S-S. Pull the pin located at the handle, because you can't squeeze the handle till you pull the pin out. Aim the nozzle, aim the hose at the base of the fire, not up in the flames, but make sure they understand the base of the fire is where all the chemical reactions going on, which creates the fire. Squeeze the handle of the trigger and sweep from side to side. Now they need to be about 6, 8, maybe 10 feet away from the fire. I would say 8 is a good number. So they get a good spray on the fire. And if that doesn't extinguish it, then you immediately go into your evacuation plan. So a lot of things to think about when you're using fire extinguishers. Nothing would be worse than to take the fire extinguisher down, pull the pin, squeeze the handle, and nothing happens. So make sure you always have an exit and that you're not cornered up somewhere by using that fire extinguisher. Now, a lot of times, and you heard Scott mention at the beginning, when you review the claims, and I've seen this quite often over the years, that a lot of times your claims, especially when they're the strain sprain type claims, lifting, pushing, pulling type injuries, a lot of times it's moving objects and lifting objects. And so talk about that. And we do see that a lot. We notice sometimes even in the first 90 days, we start seeing some of those injuries. So within the first year, I could see where probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% of your injuries may be from your new employees. So that's why this is so important that we go over these when we're onboarding new employees. So I always tell them to make sure they check the weight of an object, whether it's on the floor or it's waist high. And there is nothing worse than to pull something off a shelf over your head, and by the time you get it off the shelf, you realize it's more than you can handle. That's going to be a problem. So make sure you check the weight. Make sure you have a plan, that you have your path that you're going to travel. Make sure you have that designated and there's no obstacles in the way and you know where you're going with it. Lift with your legs, keep your back straight. I don't know how many times we bend over at the waist, we fail to bend our knees. And when you pick something up, you'll see the back bow, and then you'll make that noise. You know that noise you make when you pick things up and you're picking it up with your back, that should be your first signal that you just picked it up wrong. Okay, make sure you bend your knees, keep your back and your neck straight, keep the load close to you, and lift with your legs, which are the strongest part of your body anyway. Keep the object close to the abdomen as possible. That's because your center of balance right there. Set the load down, keeping your back straight. Remember to bend your knees and not your back. That is the main thing. That is the best way to prevent those strain and sprain type injuries, whether you strain your neck or your back or your shoulder or whatever it might be. So good stuff there. Also, we talk a little bit about ergonomics. You know, I remember back, I think it was somewhere around 2000 when OSHA tried to push through the ergonomic standard. And Congress looked at it, and if I remember right, I think it was going to cost industry about $6 billion back in 2000 to implement this thing. And the Congress said, no, sorry, business can't afford this. So they shot down the ergonomic standard. But still, there are some things in there that I think are helpful when it comes to reducing and eliminating accidents and injuries. Maintain a position closest to the neutral, like a handshake, something that, again, that's your center of the body. That you look at on a shelf, they're like handshake high, which is typically waist high, is a good position. The best position is different for everyone because of different heights and different sizes. So we kind of have to take a look at that, adjust workstations until a position is found with the greatest comfort. Obviously, you want to stretch. I talk about this all the time. There's this thing that we miss sometimes, and it's called fit for duty. And you see the next part says stretch hands, necks, back, shoulder, arms, things like that. And you see athletes run out on the field before the game, and what you don't see them immediately go into the game. There's a period of what they do they call warm up. and that's where they're stretching, and they're doing that to prevent injuries. And we see it all the time, whether it's on the football field or on the court or on the diamond, wherever it might be. You see that because they're warming up their muscles to try to prevent injuries. And I'm not so sure that we should get too far away from that at work. I think there's a reasonable amount of merit there that we could help prevent injuries, especially if you're doing a lot of cold lifting. That's something you really want to make sure you warm up. Break up repetitive tasks and other activities. So if you've got someone doing something that's a heavy duty repetitive motion, you might want to break that up some. I just think that's a good thing. So making sure that your new employees understand all this, I think it's huge. Now, from time to time, we run into claims where someone has fallen in the parking lot. Either they have been running, or maybe it was raining that day and they fell and slipped and tripped in a pothole or an uneven piece of concrete or whatever it might be. Making sure that every so often that either your HR people or maybe your safety person or designate someone to go out and just do a parking lot safety survey. Let's look at our parking lot. Make sure we don't have big potholes or big uneven pieces of concrete, things that could cause a slip, trip, or some kind of fall is what I'm really trying to get to. But at the same time, let's make sure that our new employees understand they wear shoes with traction on days of conditions where it could be rain, ice, or frost, maybe even here. Report icy areas and tell them how to report that. If you see something that could be an unsafe condition, tell them how to report that. Make sure they know to come to their HR, their team leader, their supervisor, whoever that might be, and report any broken, uneven areas that could cause slips, falls, especially in the walkway areas. And emphasize no running in the parking lot. I see people all the time, they get off work and it's kind of raining a little bit and you see it's like scattering. It's not if, it's when. That's what we're looking for. Parking lot safety inspections is really important, so I would suggest that, but I would also make sure that the new employee understands that if you see things like this, and give them a direction, give them someone that they can report that to. When we talk about the hazards of the facilities, it's critically important that the new employee understand the unique hazards of your facility. Again, they may be coming from somewhere who had very little hazards. You may have very little hazards, but making sure that they understand it, whether it's some kind of UV light or some kind of laser light, because of the equipment we're using today, understanding that forklifts may be in an area, lift trucks, there may be moving powered industrial trucks that they need to watch out for. Could be overhead cranes. It could be high noise level, sparks, especially in a lot of our welding areas where in the automotive industry, you may be welding parts and sparks are flying everywhere, flying particles, trip hazards, fire hazards. There's just a lot to cover, but it's important that they understand these things and that we can cover those things with them so that they can protect themselves. And that rolls us right into how do they protect themselves. And, you know, obviously PPE is normally your last line of defense. You want to do either an engineering policy or maybe some kind of administrative policy. And if you can't engineer out the hazard, then you go to PPE. Make sure they understand that if you need safety glasses, then safety glasses are required. And people who fail to abide by the safety regulations, then the discipline discharge policy would kick in, whether it's a verbal or written or whatever it might be. But whatever's required in the production area, whether it's hard hats or safety glasses or steel-toed shoes or hearing protection, whatever it might be, especially if you have high noise levels in your area. And make sure they know your human resource manager or supervisor will inform you about those things. Tell them how they can replace them if something goes wrong. Maybe their glasses get broken or skin up, or even sometimes they leave them at home. Also hearing protection, those things. PPE doesn't last forever, so just make sure that they understand what the limitations are, how to use them, how to put them on, how to keep them clean. Those are critically important for the new employee that might not be familiar with those things. Now, cranes is a different thing. Just keep in mind all your operators have to be certified. Overhead cranes or hazardous piece of equipment. They can be if they're not maintained properly and operated properly. Make sure the employees know that they always keep all body parts out of pinch points and all possible fall zones where they may be lifting something. Make sure they never travel into the path of where an overhead load is. Most of the time, the crane operator, if it's a bridge crane especially, which is what I see a lot of, You have the crane operator, and then hopefully you have a monitor out front who is in front of the load, making sure that everybody understands. Even though the crane warning tone is going off, sometimes people have something on their mind, they really don't hear it. So you have a monitor out there making sure that people are not getting in the way of the load coming through. And make sure you do your daily crane inspections. That's daily crane inspections, daily forklift inspections, or things that you're going to have to present in an OSHA inspection or any other inspection. So we talk about forklifts. All operators have to be certified. If you're onboarding a new person and they have certification, I think that's great, but I also say it's important that they go through your program so that they know your facility and the unique hazards of your facility. If they're not operators, make sure they know to yield to the lift trucks. Make sure they understand to make eye contact with the forklift operator to know that you're on the same page. Sometimes people will walk right out in front of a forklift operator thinking he's going to stop, and the forklift operator's thinking they're going to stop. So making sure you address that so you avoid that accident or injury that could be happening. Always make sure the operator knows you're in the area before you approach it. That is something that is critical to go over with your new employees. If they don't walk up behind a forklift or beside a forklift and the operator not know you're there. Make eye contact with the operator anytime you approach the forklift. These are just little tidbits I think that is critically important that we go over with new employees, new orientation to make sure they do these things. Now, if you're dealing with some chemicals in your facility, obviously you want to go through hazard communication. 29 CFR 1910-1200 is where you locate those. You know we have hazard communication, and then we have Global Harmonized System, the GHS program that we've been dealing with for the last few years. This is for hazardous chemicals. Not all chemicals are hazardous. Make sure that it's hazardous chemicals, and if their job, the new employee's job will be dealing with some kind of hazardous chemical, whether it's a flammable or an irritant or whatever it might be, make sure that they understand that chemical, they understand what the exposure is, they understand how to protect themselves, and in an inspection, that is definitely going to come up. So when you see that red diamond on the side of the label, the new labels are really neat. I kind of like those. You see the red diamond, that is automatically telling you it is a hazardous chemical. Now, the picture inside that diamond will determine what type hazard it is. So you want to look at that. And up under it, you're going to see the word that says danger or warning. Obviously, the employee needs to understand that this is where I need more information. If a door says danger on it, that doesn't mean for me to go running in. So if you're dealing with a chemical that has danger on it, that doesn't mean just jump into it and start washing your hands with it. There's more information. The red flammability, the blue health, the yellow reactivity, the white could be a special. Look at all those categories rated 1 to 4, 4 being the worst. The higher the number, the greater the hazard. So if you had a flammable that is a class 4 flammable, then yeah, we can run into some issues there. So just be aware of that and make sure your new employees understand all that. And it's good to give them that 9-category GHS diamond so they can become familiar with those pictures and what they represent is always good. Safety data sheets, once we get past the labels and it doesn't have the information that we need, then we have to go to the SDS, the safety data sheets. Make sure you have them for all hazardous chemicals, not all chemicals, all hazardous. Make sure that the new employee understands where those sheets are located and how they can get access to them. Some people keep them on computers, some people keep hard copy. However you do that, just make sure your new employee understands how to access it and can get in that information that they need to know about that particular chemical. The SDS details the information about the properties, the hazards, the first aids, the storage of every hazardous chemical that you're using or that maybe even you have on site. Now, they may not be using all of them. So if they're using alcohol, then you need to make sure they understand that it's flammable and all the protection for that particular hazardous chemical. Now, a couple of things there when you're dealing with those hazardous chemicals. Make sure that they have the proper PPE and that they know how to use that PPE as well. If you keep your SDSs in the break area or you keep them on a right to know station on the wall, just make sure that employee understands that here's where they are and here's how you can access them. If it's a computer, just make sure they understand how to get in that terminal and find what they're looking for. Lockout tagout is a big issue. I guess just about every OSHA inspection that I deal with, this is going to pop up at some point, whether you're manufacturing or whether you're auto parts or your lumber or whatever area you might be in. You might not see this very much in some retail settings, but if you're in some kind of manufacturing, you count on it, this is going to pop up. 29 CFR 1910-147 starts telling you the rules and regulations and the standard for how you conduct a lockout tagout to de-energize equipment before you perform any kind of repair, service, or maintenance, or whatever it might be. So keeping your lockout tagout, making sure your employees, especially your new onboarding employees, that when they see locks and tags, that they understand what's going on. It's really important that they understand that, and they know not to be trying to start up a piece of equipment that has a lock or a tag on it. Just don't be fooling with it, stay away from it. So remember, lockout, tag out, isolate and control the energy, such as electricity. It could be hydraulics, could be pneumatics, pressurized water, it could be a lot of things. Don't try to start up the machine and never operate the machine if you're unauthorized or untrained to do that. I've only seen that a couple of times lately where someone was injured because they were trying to operate a piece of equipment that they weren't authorized to or trained to, and ended up in an injury of some form. Quickly, I want to talk about OSHA 300 just for a second, especially whether you're a direct employer and you're on all your employees, then obviously your injuries that pull the triggers and they hit the requirement of recording those on your lockout, on your OSHA 300. But if you're using a temp service, I just want real quick, I went through a situation not long ago, and I want to make sure everybody understands this, because we found a flaw in this during our OSHA inspection and during the OSHA interview with the employees. The situation was a company was using a temp service and they had a temp supervisor on site. Well, in most categories, if that temp supervisor is handling the daily supervision, then obviously injuries at that point will go on that temp service log, 300 log. But what we found out during this particular case, and this is something I want you to be aware of because this company really wasn't aware of it, that it was happening like this. The temp service supervisor that was on site was really there for hiring and firing and maybe personal time off, keeping up with stuff like that. The daily supervision was still coming from the company. The production managers and supervisors on the floor was saying, okay, Scott, you run this machine until 10 o'clock, and then after your break, you go down to machine 14 and you run that until lunchtime. Well, at that point, that on-floor supervisor is directing that temp service employee's activities. So therefore, during the employee interview, when that came out, it was pretty obvious that that injury that we were talking about should have went on the company employees 300 log instead of the temp service. Now, bottom line, what I'm saying is if you have a temp supervisor, they're on the floor, let them do the supervising. If you want those 300 injuries to go on their 300 log, if it comes to find out that your company supervisors are still directing the activities every day, OSHA is going to say that goes on the company's 300 log. So just FYI, we just dealt with that, and it was pretty intense, but that was the outcome after we battled and battled. So other than that, I hope that was some good information for you. I tried to keep it from being so boring, but there's a lot of topics that we need to cover each and every day. So now we'll get into our question and answer period. And once we get into any questions that you might have or things that maybe we want to discuss, maybe something I missed, be happy to answer those questions right now.
All right, thank you, Rick. Do we have any questions? A lot of information there. Do we have any questions about any of that?
Just let them know the PowerPoint's available.
Yeah, the PowerPoint will be, this presentation will be archived under webinars on the Alicomp website under the safety section. We also have our safety library that's available to you. A lot of the resources or a lot of the items that Rick discussed, we have resources that are available to you. If you do not have access to our online safety library, it is password protected, but it's a free resource for our insureds. You can send me an email, and that is scott@alacompins.com. It's scott@alacompins.com, and I'll be happy to get you set up on that. If there are any questions that come later, feel free to shoot me an email, and we'll get any of those questions answered. Otherwise, if there are not any questions, this will conclude this webinar, and we definitely appreciate each of you joining us. You all have a good rest of your week, and thank you.